The study doors don't usually slam at UK Castle. That's the first thing you need to understand about what happened on a Tuesday morning that nobody on the household staff will ever forget. And honestly, most of them are still talking about it in the corridors when they think no one important is listening. King Charles doesn't raise his voice. In 31 years on the throne, the man has handled a border dispute with the neighboring duchy, 2 recessions, a flood that took out half the eastern farmland, and a scandal involving his own younger brother, all without so much as loosening his collar in public. Ask anyone who has worked close to him for more than a year, and they'll tell you the same thing. He gets quiet when he's angry. Quiet and controlled and precise. The kind of anger that shows up later in a memo, not in a raised voice across a room. So, when 3 separate staff members reported hearing him shout from behind a closed oak door, word moved through the castle faster than the morning tea cart could make it from the kitchen to the east wing. By the time the story reached the scullery, it had already grown legs of its own. Someone said the king had thrown a book. Someone else swore they heard glass break, though nobody could later explain what glass would have even been in that study to break. None of that happened, as far as we can tell. But here's what actually did happen, and it's a stranger story than the rumor mill managed to invent on its own. It started 3 days earlier, with a letter that Sophie almost didn't open that morning, because she was already running late for a school visit across the river. Sophie married into the UK family 18 years ago, and in that time, she's built a reputation for being the calm one. The one who smooths things over when a press event goes sideways. The one who shows up to hospital openings and rural school visits and somehow never once makes headlines for the wrong reason, in a family where that is not a small achievement. If you asked anyone in the press office to describe her in 3 words, difficult would not be one of them. Steady, maybe. Careful. Almost boringly reliable, in the best possible sense of that phrase. Which is exactly why what she did 3 days later caught the entire palace so completely off guard. The letter, sent under the king's personal seal, requested her presence in the West Study on Tuesday at 10 in the morning to finalize matters regarding the estate. Dunmore is the largest single property in the family's private holdings, something close to 4,000 acres of farmland, orchard, and forest that has technically belonged to the crown since before Alaric's grandfather ever sat the throne. For the last decade or so, it has operated under a private family trust. And every few years, the trust requires updated paperwork, mostly to reflect tenancy changes, tax law updates, that kind of thing. Usually, it's a formality. Usually, it takes 15 minutes, a fountain pen, and a cup of tea afterward. Sophie's assistant later said she read the letter twice, set it down on the hallway table without a word, and made a phone call that lasted almost 40 minutes with the door of her private sitting room closed. Nobody in the household knew who she'd called. They found out on Tuesday, and by then it was too late to stop what was coming. At 9:52 that morning, a car nobody on the household staff recognized pulled through the side gate, the one usually reserved for deliveries and the occasional visiting dignitary who wants to avoid the main press line. The guard on duty that morning logged the visitor in his notebook, the old-fashioned kind, still handwritten, as M. Voss, legal counsel, accompanying Her Royal Highness Sophie. That single line in a guard's logbook is the reason this whole story exists at all. Nobody brings a lawyer to a routine trust signing. Not at UK. Not in a family where the last 3 generations have handled these matters with a fountain pen, a witness from the household legal office, and a glass of sherry afterward if the mood was good. So when Sophie walked into the West Study at 10 o'clock sharp, with a stranger in a plain gray suit half a step behind her, the king's private secretary, a man named Halloway, who has worked that exact study for 19 years and has seen just about everything a royal household can produce, said afterward that he genuinely felt the temperature of the room change the moment the second person crossed the threshold. Alaric looked up from his desk, saw the unfamiliar face, and asked the only question that mattered in that moment. Who is this? Not really a question. More of a demand wearing a question's clothing, according to Holloway, who was standing close enough to hear the exact tone. Sophie, by every account, did not flinch. She introduced Voss by name and title, explained plainly that she had requested an independent review of the Dunmore paperwork before signing anything binding for another decade, and asked, quite reasonably, if they could simply begin. The king did not sit back down. Here is where the accounts of what happened next start to differ slightly, depending on which staff member you ask and how close they were standing to the study door at the time, but the broad shape of the story stays consistent enough across every version that we can piece together a fairly reliable picture. Alaric reportedly told Sophie that the paperwork was standard, that it matched every prior renewal going back through his father's reign and probably his grandfather's before that, and that bringing in outside counsel felt to him like an insult directed at the family's own legal office, an office that has served the crown loyally for decades. He had apparently expected the whole meeting to be a 5-minute signature and a firm handshake before lunch. Instead, he was being asked to sit and wait while a lawyer he had never met before that morning worked her way through 40 dense pages of trust language, clause by clause, with a pen in her hand and no intention of rushing. Sophie held her ground the entire time. She told him calmly, according to 2 separate people who were present, that the trust documents this year included language she did not recognize from previous renewals, specifically around how proceeds from a recent land lease on the northern section of Dunmore would be distributed going forward. She was careful to say she wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She simply wanted to understand exactly what she was putting her name to before that name went on a binding document for another 10 years. That is when the king's composure finally went. Witnesses describe him standing abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, his voice suddenly loud enough to carry clean through the heavy oak door and into the hallway, where at least 2 staff members were pretending very hard to be occupied with paperwork of their own. He reportedly said something to the effect that she would sign it because it was her duty to sign it. Full stop. No further discussion required. One staff member, speaking anonymously afterward because nobody wanted their name attached to quoting the king in anger, said the actual words were sharper than that summary suggests, but declined to repeat them for the record. Sophie reportedly did not raise her voice back at any point. She said, simply and evenly, that she understood her duty perfectly well, and that part of that duty, as she saw it, was making absolutely sure the family's holdings were being managed honestly, both for her own children's sake and for the tenants who actually worked that land. Then she turned back to Voss and asked her to please continue reading. The king left the room without another word. The door behind him is the one that slammed hard enough to rattle the windows down the hall. Over the next 2 hours, while the king reportedly paced the adjoining corridor and refused 3 separate attempts by Holloway to coax him back into the study, Voss worked steadily through the Dunmore Trust documents, line by line, page by page, occasionally circling a phrase or flipping back several pages to cross-reference something she'd read earlier. What she found, according to a summary that was later shared quietly with senior household staff, wasn't evidence of anything criminal. It was smaller than that, and in some ways stranger and more embarrassing than outright wrongdoing would have been. The northern lease, signed roughly 18 months earlier with an agricultural company nobody in the family seemed to know much about personally, included a revenue clause that redirected a percentage of the lease profits into a secondary holding account that had never appeared in any previous version of the Dunmore Trust. The account itself was entirely legal. It was disclosed, technically, in a footnote buried on page 31 of 40. But it had never been explained to Sophie, or apparently to anyone at all outside the estate management office, in language a normal person could actually follow without a law degree. Voss's assessment, when she finally delivered it, was simple and almost anticlimactic given the morning's drama. Nothing illegal here, nothing scandalous, not in the way rumors would later suggest. But absolutely nothing anyone should be signing without a proper explanation first, and honestly, nothing that should have required a full standoff in the king's own study just to get that explanation out into the open. When Sophie relayed all of this to the king later that afternoon, in a much quieter conversation that Holloway also happened to witness from just outside the door, Alaric reportedly went silent for close to a full minute, which those who know him say is nearly unheard of. Then he asked, in a noticeably lower voice, for the estate management office to come explain the clause to him directly, that same day, before dinner. By evening, the story circulating inside the castle walls had already begun shifting from the Duchess embarrassed the king in front of his own staff to something closer to the Duchess actually found something his own office never bothered to flag for him. Staff gossip moves fast in a place like UK, and it doesn't always land where you'd expect it to. That doesn't mean the tension in the building simply evaporated overnight. Sources close to the household say Alaric remained visibly frustrated for days afterward. Less because of what the lawyer actually found, and more because of exactly how publicly and how suddenly the whole thing had unfolded in front of people who would absolutely talk about it later, which, as you're watching this video, they clearly have. A king, even a fairly reasonable one, does not love being made to wait outside his own study. Sophie, for her part, gave no formal public statement about any of it, which is very much in character for her. But she reportedly told a close friend afterward, over what was described as a very long dinner, that she would sign the Dunmore Trust the moment she genuinely understood every clause inside it. And not one single minute before that. King or no king, family tradition or no family tradition, the household staff, naturally, have not stopped talking. One under-butler reportedly told a colleague that in 19 years of service, he had never once seen a door slam in that particular wing of the castle, and that he'd honestly assumed the hinges were built to prevent exactly that kind of thing from happening. A kitchen maid claims she saw the king walk the length of the corridor outside the study no fewer than 11 times that morning, though 11 is almost certainly an exaggeration born from retelling the story one too many times over the following week. And then, 4 days after the original meeting, a second unfamiliar car arrived at the side gate early in the morning, before most of the household staff had even started their shifts. This time the guard's logbook simply read, "Visitor, business unclear," accompanied by estate management. No name given up front. The car stayed for just under 2 hours and left quietly, without anyone from the press office being informed beforehand, which is itself unusual for anything involving Dunmore business these days. Here's the part nobody inside that castle is talking about publicly just yet, though a few people clearly know more than they're saying. The agricultural company behind that northern lease, the one whose quiet profit clause started this entire chain of events, shares a company director with another business that has come up before in UK circles, under very different and considerably messier circumstances a few years back. We're going to dig into exactly who that director is and why the connection might explain a great deal more than one tense morning in a study in the next episode of this series. If you want to know who was actually sitting across the table during that second, quieter visit, and why it might change how you see everything that happened in that West study, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss it when it goes live. Let's back up for a second, though, because there's context here that matters, and it's the kind of context most channels covering this story have completely skipped over. Dunmore hasn't always been quiet, contested ground. Back when Alaric's father held the throne, The estate was mostly farmland leased out to a handful of families who had worked it for generations, some of them going back over a century. The trust that governs it today was actually Alaric's own idea, drawn up not long after he took the crown, meant to protect those tenant families from exactly the kind of quiet, buried clause that just caused all this trouble. There's a real irony in that, if you think about it. The system built to prevent this sort of thing is the same system that ended up hiding it, mostly because nobody had bothered to update the plain language summary that used to accompany every renewal in the earlier years of the trust. Halloway, for what it's worth, has apparently said privately that the plain language summary simply stopped being included around 6 years ago, when a new estate manager took over and decided the 40-page document spoke for itself. Whether that was an oversight or something closer to convenience is exactly the kind of question this story raises without fully answering, at least not yet. What makes Sophie's decision to bring in outside counsel so unusual isn't just that it broke with tradition. It's that she had, by most accounts, every reason not to make a fuss. She isn't next in line for anything. Her role in the family has always been supportive rather than central. The kind of position where staying agreeable tends to be the easier, quieter path. Nobody would have blinked if she'd simply signed the papers and asked her questions afterward, privately, the way these things are usually handled. She didn't do that. And according to people close to her, the reason comes down to something fairly simple. Her own name, and by extension her own children's financial future, was going to be tied to that trust for another decade. She wanted to actually understand what she was agreeing to before her signature made it permanent, regardless of how uncomfortable that made anyone else in the room. There's also the matter of timing, which a few sharper observers inside the household have pointed out. The Northern lease was signed 18 months ago, which happens to be almost exactly when the estate management office brought on that new agricultural partner in the first place. Nobody's suggesting anything beyond coincidence just yet, but 18 months is also roughly how long it's been since anyone outside that office actually sat down and read the full Dunmore paperwork line by line, rather than skimming the summary page and signing where indicated. Which brings us back to that second car at the side gate, 4 days later, the one logged simply as visitor, business unclear. A member of the household staff, who asked not to be named for obvious reasons, said the 2-hour meeting that followed was unusually tense, though far quieter than the blow-up in the West Study days earlier. No shouting this time, no slammed doors. Just a long, careful conversation behind closed doors involving the king, a representative from the estate office, and, notably, Voss herself, who had apparently been asked back for a second consultation, this time at the king's own request, rather than Sophie's. That detail alone tells you something about how the week actually ended, regardless of how it began. A king who reportedly called outside counsel an insult to his own legal office on Tuesday was, by that following Saturday, sitting across a table from that same lawyer, asking her to walk him through the paperwork himself. Whether that amounts to Alaric quietly admitting Sophie had a point, or simply a king doing his due diligence once the matter had already become impossible to ignore, depends entirely on who inside that castle you ask. What isn't in dispute is that the Dunmore Trust, as of this recording, still hasn't been signed. Not by Sophie, and as far as anyone can tell, not by the king either. That alone should tell you this story isn't finished. There's a reason the estate office has gone quiet on the matter, a reason nobody's issued so much as a routine statement confirming the renewal is proceeding as planned, and a reason that Agricultural Company's shared director keeps coming up in conversations nobody wants to have on the record. We'll be laying all of that out in the next episode, including exactly who that director is, what the earlier, messier UK business involving that name actually was, and why it might mean this entire standoff was never really about a fountain pen and a 14-minute signing appointment at all. If this kind of slow-burn royal drama is what you come to this channel for, you already know what to do. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling us who you think is really behind that northern lease. Because a few of you in the comments last episode were closer to the truth than you probably realized.